Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with spaghetti squash carbonara. That's right. I'm going to show you what I think is the most delicious way to eat spaghetti squash. Plus, I'm also going to show you what is definitely the best technique for prepping spaghetti squash, which as far as looks and texture goes, produces the closest thing to actual pasta or noodles. And to get started, we will cut up one large spaghetti squash, which most people do lengthwise. And I did it that way for many years, until I eventually learned that cutting across the squash was so much better. And we'll begin this by cutting a little bit off the ends. And the skin on this is extremely hard, so until the knife blade has broken the skin a little bit, we'll apply almost no pressure. And once we are applying pressure, we'll make sure our hand is nowhere close. And yes, that piece went on the floor. But anyway, the point is be extremely careful. And like I just said, make sure the blade of the knife is in through the skin a little bit before you apply any significant downward pressure. And it might look like I'm using a dull knife, but I'm not. The skin really is extremely hard and glass-like, but as long as your other hand is nowhere near the knife, as you actually start to cut down, you should be fine. And the only exception for keeping your hand away from the knife is that we are allowed to use it on top of the knife to kind of pound down to help drive that blade into the squash. Okay, that's fine because your hand's on top of the blade, and there's really no danger being cut using that maneuver, but be careful anyway. And by the way, we don't need perfect uniformity here. As long as we end up with 3 relatively even sections, and we finish up with the exact same number of fingers we started with, we will consider this step a great success. And that's it. Now that all the hard work's done, we will take a spoon and scrape out all the seeds before we transfer these onto a parchment-lined sheet pan. And as I do this, you might notice the fibers are running in like a circular pattern around the squash, almost like the rings on a tree, which is why cutting this across, as you will see once this is baked, gives us the most spaghetti-like appearance and texture. And then before these are roasted, I like to coat them with olive oil and then sprinkle them with a generous application of salt. Since spaghetti squash is nutritious, but it's really not that delicious unless it's well seasoned. And while I guess we can just season at the end, when we add our carbonara ingredients, I really do prefer to give it a little head start at this point. And that's it. Once our gourd is oiled and salted, we are going to roast that in a 400-degree oven until it's tender enough to eat and to pull into spaghetti-like strands, which could take anywhere between like 45 minutes and an hour and a half, depending on the size and shape of your squash. And since we have some time while that's happening, we can go ahead and prep our pancetta, which is simply Italian cured pork belly. Oh yeah, the same stuff we make bacon out of, which is why when we unroll this to cut it, you're going to see it looks exactly like a cross-section of bacon. But pancetta is not smoked like most bacons are, which is why it produces a much different flavor. And then what we'll do is cut this into like 1/4-inch strips, and then we'll turn the strips and cut them across every 1/4 inch. And no, it doesn't have to be a 1/4 inch, but whatever size you decide on, you should try to make them as uniform as you can, since we want all these pieces to brown up at the same rate. And yes, if you watched our actual spaghetti carbonara video, you know we're supposed to be using guanciale, which is cured pork jowl or cheek. But pancetta is easier to find and virtually identical, so we're going with that. Oh, be careful, sometimes there's like a wax paper on the outside that we'll definitely want to remove before we dice, since nobody wants to be chewing on that. But anyway, we'll go ahead and dice up about a 1/2 pound. At which point we'll place the skillet on medium-high heat, in which we've drizzled some olive oil, and then we will cook our diced pancetta, stirring occasionally, until it's caramelized and beautifully browned. And don't be afraid if when you first start out, things are looking a little juicy and there's moisture in the pan. That's totally fine, since that's going to evaporate, at which point your pancetta is going to start pan frying in the olive oil, as well as the fat being rendered out of the pork. And once it does start sizzling and turning brown, I usually like to back the heat down to medium or medium-low, since we don't want the smaller pieces getting too dark, before the bigger pieces are where we want them. Oh, and I did mention bacon earlier, which you can theoretically use for this, but that smoky profile might overpower the other ingredients, and we might lose that classic carbonara vibe. But anyway, use it if you want. I mean, you are, after all, the star of your spaghetti squash carbonara. But I'm hoping if you can find pancetta, that's what you use. In any event, once that's nicely browned, we will turn off the heat, and we'll wait for our squash to finish roasting. And after about an hour and 15 minutes, this is what mine looked like. And as I grab a couple forks to start pulling this apart, prepare to be amazed, since as long as you don't overcook this and it gets all soft and mushy, you're going to end up with something that's shockingly similar in appearance to spaghetti. And if you grab a piece to taste it, it should be tender enough to eat and not taste raw, but I think it should definitely have a little bit of texture intact. Oh, and also keep in mind, we're actually going to put this back in the oven once it's been mixed with all the other ingredients. So if it's ever so slightly undercooked at this point, that's probably fine. And definitely better than overcooked, since when it gets to a certain point, it's going to get very, very watery and soft, and nowhere near as useful in making a carbonara. But anyway, what we'll do is scoop all that out, and then we'll set it aside while we mix up our carbonara sauce, which starts with a couple egg yolks, to which we will add a big old spoon of freshly ground black pepper, which of course is where the name carbonara comes from, since apparently those black specks look like coal dust. And what we'll do is add a splash of water, and then take a whisk and mix this very thoroughly. And once we feel like that's happened, we can go ahead and transfer our still probably hot squash in. And the reason it's nice if this stuff is still hot is because after we transfer that in, we're going to add some chunks of butter, as well as our cooked pancetta and any rendered fat in the pan. And we want there to be enough heat to melt the butter. So if you roasted your squash ahead of time, I would probably melt the butter in the pan of pancetta before you add it here, since that's going to make everything much easier to mix together with a couple forks, which is what we want to do very, very thoroughly before we add our cheeses. And while I do that, let me explain one of the only ways to screw this recipe up, and that would be to expect it to come out exactly like spaghetti carbonara. So all we're really trying to do here is produce something that has a similar appearance, and sorta kinda a little bit of the same texture, that has a flavor profile very close to carbonara. And as I hope you find out, that's pretty much what you're going to get. But anyway, once that's all mixed up and the butter's melted in, we will add in our grated cheese and give it another toss. And I'm using half Pecorino and half Parmigiano Reggiano, but all one or the other would also be fine. And once we have that cheese evenly mixed in, we should give it a taste, since depending on the saltiness of your pancetta, and whether or not you seasoned your squash when you roasted it, you might need another pinch of salt here. And after sampling, I decided to toss a little more in. And that's it. We'll grab some tongs and give it one last toss, at which point we can transfer it into some kind of baking dish. Since to finish this, we're going to pop it back in the oven so we can serve it nice and piping hot. Oh, and I almost forgot to tell you, when we added our pancetta back in, we should reserve a couple tablespoons so we can garnish the top when this comes out of the oven. Right, that's optional, but I think it looks really nice. And then once everything's been transferred in, I like to take a couple forks and kind of tease this, just to make sure everything's not compressed, and we've sort of fluffed everything up a little bit, which might be unnecessary, and I could be overthinking this, but it just seems like something we should do. Speaking of which, I also think we should dust the top with a little more cheese before it goes back in, so that's what I did. And that's it. We can now transfer this back into our 400-degree oven for about 15 minutes, or until it's heated through and hopefully looks like this. Oh yeah, that looks very carbonara-like. And then to finish this up, we will sprinkle over any reserved pancetta, which if we're being honest, you've probably eaten most of. But whatever you have left, go ahead and apply it over the top. At which point we'll finish up with one last grating of cheese, as well as the obligatory sprinkling of chopped Italian parsley. And that's it, our spaghetti squash carbonara is ready to enjoy. And that, my friends, as long as you're not expecting it to taste exactly like spaghetti carbonara, is an unbelievably delicious thing to eat, and probably most likely one of the most incredible squash dishes you've ever enjoyed. And while this obviously is not going to have all the carby goodness of regular spaghetti, our squash does have a nice level of starchiness to it, which is why above and beyond the similar appearance, it works so well for a preparation like this. And you could and probably should eat this as a main course, maybe next to a nice crisp green salad. But I also think this would make a fantastic side dish and would be perfect next to a roast chicken or turkey or ham or pork loin. But whether you serve this as a side or a main course, I really do hope you give it a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always,